Thank you for joining our program, Call to Serve, 75 Years Recruiting Women, developed in partnership with the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in Chicago, Arlington National Cemetery, and the Military Women's Memorial in Washington, D.C. I am Kathleen McDonald from the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. Founded in 2003, the PMML's mission is to increase the public's understanding of military history, military affairs, and national security, as well as how military service and the sacrifices made by the men and women who have worn the uniform have shaped our country's democracy. June 12, 2023 marks the 75th anniversary of the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, which legally permitted women to serve in all branches of the U.S. Armed Forces in a number of official capacities. Our moderator and three speakers will discuss the history of women's service defending our nation, both before and after this act, and the dramatic changes in the past 5 years. Today's moderator, Allison Finkelstein, serves as senior historian at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Arlington National Cemetery represents Americans' people for past, present, and future generations by laying to rest those who have served our nation with dignity and honor while immersing guests in the cemetery's living history. Allison Finkelstein serves as the senior historian at Arlington National Cemetery. She earned her PhD in U.S. history from the University of Maryland, College Park, where she also studied historic preservation. She previously worked for the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services History Office and Library, the American Battle Monuments Commission, and the Department of Defense Vietnam War Commemoration Office. Her first book, Forgotten Veterans, Invisible Memorials, How American Women Commemorated the Great War, 1917 to 1945, was published by the University of Alabama Press. It won the Mid-Atlantic Regional Archives Conference's 2022 Arlene Custer Memorial Award for Best Book. From 2017 to 2018, the Arlington County Board appointed her as chair of the Arlington World War I Commemoration Task Force. Our three speakers come from the Military Women's Memorial located in Washington, D.C., which is the leading memorial and education center honoring the commitment, contributions, and experiences of service women, including the 3 million women who have served in and with the armed forces since the American Revolution. Our first speaker is Britta Granrud. Britta is a proud Army brat who has lived all over the world and is director of the collections for the Military Women's Memorial Foundation Collection. For over 25 years, Britta has managed the collection of over 8,000 donations of documents, photographs, oral histories, uniforms, objects, and audiovisual material representing all eras and all services of the America's women's military history. Britta has been a curator for all exhibits at the Military Women's Memorial and co-curator of the exhibit In Her Words, Women's Duty and Service in World War I, developed jointly with the Smithsonian's National Postal Museum. She is a contributing author of A Defense Weapon Known to Be of Value, Service Women in the Korean War Era, published by the Foundation's own Military Women's Press. Britta holds a BA in art history from Mary Washington College. Britta is joined by her colleague, Marilla Cushman. Marilla joined the Military Women's Memorial Foundation staff in March 1997 as the Director of Public Affairs and Development, and served in that capacity until June 2021, when she assumed her current position as Senior Advisor to the President. She provides overall advice and assistance to the President on all issues related to the operations of the Foundation and Memorial. Prior to joining the Foundation, she served nearly 25 years in the U.S. Army, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. Her assignments included Special Assistant for Public Affairs to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Chief Media Inquiries, Headquarters Department of the Army, Chief Public Affairs Plan and Policy Division, Headquarters U.S. Army Europe, Executive Director to the Defense Secretary's Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Service, and Program Manager, Advertising and Sales Promotion for the Army's Be All You Can Be campaign, U.S. Army Recruiting Command. She's a graduate of U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, a summa cum laude graduate of the University of Maine with a BS in education. She also attended graduate school at the University of Kansas. Our third speaker is Phyllis J. Wilson, MPA, BSN, RN, U.S. Army Chief Warrant Officer 5, retired, and president of the Military Women's Memorial. Chief Warrant Officer 5, Phyllis J. Wilson, is a 37-year veteran of the United States Army. She served as an intelligence officer with the Joint Special Operations Command and the U.S. Special Operations Command in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Phyllis is a registered nurse and a graduate of the Defense Language Institute for both German and Spanish. She has been inducted into both the Army Women's Foundation Hall of Fame and the U.S. Veterans Hall of Fame. She is the president of the Military Women's Memorial, located at the entrance of the Arlington National Cemetery, which is America's only major national monument honoring the 3 million women who have defended America from the American Revolution to today. On behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome all of you. To get started, Britta will provide us with an overview of the early history of women in the U.S. military. Welcome, Britta.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to be here with you today to provide a short introduction to women in the military and some recruiting efforts over the years. During the American Revolution, women served with the military as nurses, seamstresses, cooks, and laundresses. Some served alongside their husbands, manning cannons, or even taking over for them. They disguised themselves as men to serve as soldiers, while others became spies. There were no official recruiting efforts, but the advent of disease led General Washington to recruit around the camps for nurses to care for the sick. He also petitioned Congress for nurses. In the Civil War, as was the case during the American Revolution, women served as nurses, cooks, laundresses, soldiers, and spies. They were also active in organized volunteer aid and relief societies. Disguised women serving as soldiers often answered recruiting ads found in newspapers and sheet music. It was the nurses once again who were most needed. The Union Army appointed Dorothea Dix as superintendent of nurses for the Union Army to recruit nurses to work in the hospitals. During the Spanish-American War, thousands of U.S. soldiers sick with typhoid, malaria, and yellow fever overwhelmed the capabilities of the Army Medical Department. Dr. Anita Newcomb McGee suggested that the Daughters of the American Revolution Hospital Corps be appointed to recruit and select professionally qualified nurses to serve under contract with the U.S. Army. More than 1,500 Army contract nurses served stateside in Hawaii, Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and on the hospital ship Relief. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, it marked the first time in the history of the country that regular Army and Navy military nurses served overseas, and the first time women who were not nurses could enlist in the Navy and Marine Corps. A few women served in the Coast Guard. The U.S. Army, however, refused to enlist women officially, relying on them as contract employees and civilian volunteers. Negative public opinion, societal mores, and hesitant military leaders limited women's roles, but the country needed their skills to pursue the war effort and to move male soldiers out of office jobs and onto the battlefield. Commercial advertisers had found success with the poster, and shortly after the U.S. entered the war, the government created a division of pictorial publicity. The posters, often created by some of the country's best illustrators, quickly and colorfully conveyed messages. They appealed to women's sense of patriotic duty and national pride, their own desire to take action, their desire to help family and friends, and even fear and anger at the enemy. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and America's entry into World War II, posters started appearing again, urging women to leave the home and help the war effort. The government again created an organization to handle recruiting for both the civilian workforce and the military, including women. In 1943, shortly after the establishment of the Women's Military Services, the Office of War Information began creating posters aimed at women. Just as in World War I, most of the posters appealed to the emotions: patriotic duty, caring for the wounded, or bringing men home sooner. However, there were posters that encouraged women to embrace their own qualifications and skills, allowing for greater opportunity for them and a brighter future. The posters all conveyed that women could remain feminine and attractive, though. The lack of diversity in the posters mirrored the lack of diversity within the services. By war's end, some 400,000 American women had served at home and overseas in nearly all non-combat jobs. The post-World War II era is one of conflicts. While World War II brought about social and economic changes which broadened women's roles in society, there was also the expectation that women be mothers and homemakers. The military services had demobilized almost all women, but some leaders realized the need for a permanent corps of women. The passage of the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948 allowed for a permanent full-time place for women in the military, and although there were restrictions, it was a significant step forward and created opportunities for women. Women did not want to serve, though. They looked forward to normalcy after war. They had minor children or dependent parents. They were expected to stay in the home. The Korean War a couple years later created manpower shortages due to men going off to war. The services were also struggling with how to implement the integration of women and the desegregation of the military, which had been mandated in 1948. Despite massive recruiting campaigns, numbers remained low. The Vietnam War and the advent of the all-volunteer force in 1973 strained manpower resources once again, creating a need which allowed for greater opportunity for women. Intended to address personnel shortages, recruiting efforts highlighted the opportunities and benefits of military service, greater gender and racial equality, educational benefits, financial opportunities, including monetary bonuses for enlistment and retention, and personal fulfillment. Opportunity remains a key focus of recruiting today. Be all you can be, as the Army advertises. Thank you, and I will now turn it over to Allison.
Thank you, Britta, and good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the 1948 Women's Armed Services Integration Act with my colleagues from the Military Women's Memorial and the Pritzker Military Museum and Library. Thank you especially to the Pritzker Museum for hosting us today and shining a light on this important but too often overlooked aspect of American military history. As your moderator for the second part of this webinar, I will have two functions. First, I will provide a little bit more historical context about the Women's Armed Services Integration Act. Picking up from Britta's excellent remarks, I will share an extremely brief summary of some key points about women's military service during World War I and World War II. These two conflicts are really essential to understanding the Women's Armed Services Integration Act. Next, so that we are all on the same page, I will quickly provide a little bit more explanation about the legislation itself. For my second function, I will moderate what promises to be a fascinating discussion of topics related to the history, impact, and legacy of the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948. Let's move on now, though, to the next part of this webinar, a very brief overview of American women's participation in the First and Second World Wars. And I have to emphasize that what I'm truly sharing is just a tiny bit of that history today. I'm leaving out a lot of details for time's sake. My goal here is simply to give you enough background to really understand why the 1948 legislation was needed so that you can understand in more depth the responses that Marilla and Phyllis are going to give us to some of my questions. As Britta explained so well, American women have supported the U.S. military since the time of the American Revolution. And as she also pointed out, World War I formed a watershed moment in how women provided this support. While women continued to contribute in many traditional female support roles as grassroots volunteers, doing things like knitting socks and rolling bandages, they also served in new, more formalized ways within the structure of the actual military. For the first time ever during World War I, women enlisted in the military as fully fledged service members due to a loophole in the law that allowed women to serve in the U.S. Navy as Navy Yeoman F, the F for female, in the U.S. Marines as female Marines, and then there were even a couple women who actually served in the Coast Guard. After the war, these women received full veterans benefits, and while their service was temporary, they demonstrated that women could fully serve in the military just like men. Women could also serve in World War I as part of the U.S. Army Nurse Corps and the U.S. Navy Nurse Corps, which had been established before World War I. But unlike those Navy and Marine Corps women, they were not actually officially enlisted in the Army and Navy, and they served in this very strange, undefined status. They did not actually have official rank or full authority over the men in their care. And if it doesn't make sense to you, that's correct. It doesn't make sense. Nevertheless, these women also received veterans status. However, what I want to emphasize is that there were thousands of other women who also support the military during World War I from outside of the official armed forces. They worked as volunteers or paid civilian employees of organizations like the YMCA, the American Red Cross, or the Salvation Army, to name just a few. Others worked directly for the military as paid civilian employees, sometimes overseas in Europe. Most famously, this group included the telephone operators known as the Hello Girls. They worked for the U.S. Army's Signal Corps. It also included numerous other groups of women, such as the reconstruction aides, physical and occupational therapists who treated the wounded. Now, although these women served in uniform and under oath, they were not actually in the armed forces, and this was not always clear to them during the war. But because of gender-based restrictions on military service, they were hired in a civilian capacity only. This meant that after World War I, there was a cohort of American women who had served yet lacked veteran status. Despite their often pioneering wartime roles, they received none of the government support provided for male veterans or that small community of recognized female veterans. This means they didn't get medical care, they didn't get a bonus later on, they did not get the option for burial in a national cemetery. Frustrated by this inequitable situation, the women of the World War I generation banded together to advocate for the benefits they believed they had earned during the war. They considered themselves to be what I term unrecognized veterans. You can learn a lot more about this story in my book, Forgotten Veterans, Invisible Memorials: How American Women Commemorated the Great War. And a lot of the research for that book actually came from the Military Women's Memorial Collection and was found with a lot of help from Britta. So going back to these World War I women, to their disappointment, despite trying to fight for benefits, they were rarely successful. By the time the U.S. entered World War I, they were thoroughly fed up and determined not to let the next generation of military women suffer the same fate. They campaigned for women to be able to fully and equally serve in the military. While we could talk about how this worked with each separate branch of the military, because of time, I'm just going to use the U.S. Army as an example. In Congress, the fight for Army women was led by Representative Edith Norse Rogers, who herself had served in a civilian capacity during World War I with the YMCA and the Red Cross. Edith Norse Rogers made it her mission to prevent another generation of women being denied veteran status. To do so, she introduced the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps Act into Congress in May of 1941, even before the U.S. entered World War II. However, by the time the WAAC Act actually became law, this act did not make women fully part of the Army. It only allowed them to serve in an auxiliary. So while it did provide more benefits and security for Army women, it did not fulfill Edith Norse Rogers' original goal of making them fully part of the Army and fully veterans. So she fought on. In 1943, she introduced the Women's Army Corps Act into Congress, the WAC Act. This act created the Women's Army Corps, the WAC, as part of the regular Army instead of as an auxiliary like the WAAC. And the passage of the WAC Act finally granted Army women, not just the nurses, full military rank and veteran status. And Edith Norse Rogers actually directly cited her service in the Great War and her community of unrecognized female veterans as the inspiration for the WAC. After years of struggle, Rogers, with the support of her cohort of women from World War I, had succeeded in creating opportunities for military service for women and benefits that they had been fighting to obtain for decades. She and her compatriots had opened the door for more women to officially serve in the armed forces during World War II, even though most of her own generation still lacked such benefits for themselves. This takes us now to 1948 and the passage of the Women's Armed Services Integration Act. With the war over, women's tenure in the military was once again tenuous and in jeopardy. They needed something to change for them to continue to have the opportunity to serve in the military. In 1948, women finally got what they had been waiting for and advocating for: congressional action through the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, which President Harry Truman signed into law on June 12, 1948. This act represented a major victory in the long effort to create more equal opportunities for American women to serve in the military. The act finally allowed women to serve as permanent, regular members of the armed forces. It made the Women's Army Corps, the WAC, a permanent part of the Army, and it also authorized women to serve in the regular and reserve components of the Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps. However, the act still did not grant full equality in the armed forces. For example, it limited the number of servicewomen, and it created different rules regarding dependents if a servicewoman was married or had children. And our panelists are going to talk a lot more about these and other shortcomings in just a few minutes. What I want to emphasize is that even after this act, the campaign for women's equality in the military would continue for many years, and in so many ways it continues to this day. Now, as a historian at Arlington National Cemetery, I have to mention that several of the women involved in championing this act are actually buried here at the cemetery. They include Colonel Geraldine May, who served as the first director of the Women in the Air Force, the WAF, and she was also the first Air Force woman to hold the rank of colonel. We also have the grave of Captain Joy Bright Hancock, a Navy veteran of 2 world wars who was essential to this legislation. Arlington has the graves of so many other pioneering women. We have the grave of General Hazel Johnson Brown, the first African-American woman to achieve general officer rank, and the grave of Lieutenant Commander Barbara Allen Rainey, the first female naval aviator. In fact, we have so many graves of so many groundbreaking women that we are currently developing an education module for our education program specifically devoted to exploring women's history at the cemetery. When we complete it, it will be available on our website, education.arlingtoncemetery.mil. In the meantime, you can check out that website and learn about women through other modules, such as the Spanish-American War, African-American history, and military intelligence. I hope that my very short remarks have provided you with more of the background we need to start our discussion with our esteemed panelists. I am so honored to have 2 women that I deeply admire and respect with us today, Phyllis and Marilla from the Women's Military Memorial. They have taught me so much over the years, and I know that you all are in for a real treat as we ask them to share their expertise and knowledge about the 1948 Act, and especially about the recruitment of military women over the years. So Phyllis and Marilla, we can go ahead and unmute you and get started with our first question.
We're ready.
All right, excellent.
Let's go.
So to start us off, I'd like to ask each of you, in your estimation, what were the most significant short-term and long-term effects of the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948?
Marla, why don't you start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks again, Allison, for that great introduction and certainly for the background that you provided. It really set the stage for this discussion. Well, certainly the short-term effect, which was positive, it gave women a place, a permanent place in the regular and reserve military, and it gave them an opportunity for a career. Long-term, for those restrictions that it imposed or the prohibitions that were included in that legislation, gosh, it was, practically 7 decades of restrictions that governed the service of military women and how they would serve. It was a game changer, certainly. But indeed, it did have some pretty major restrictions that that governed, women's service for all those many years, and certainly in not a particularly positive way.
Yeah, I would say too quickly, Allison, that I think one of the key things that I learned only since I came to work here at the Military Women's Memorial, all those years in the Army, I didn't really know much about the Women's Armed Service Integration Act. I didn't realize I was a benefactress of that act of 1948 when I joined the Army, went to basic training in 1981. I had no idea that we were capped at 2% of the military, right? And if you became pregnant, you were discharged. Well, being a young soldier, soon after I joined the military, within 2 years, I was pregnant, and I reported to my commanding officer. My husband, I went to tell him that I was pregnant, and he said, well, I'll start the paperwork. And I'm like, what paperwork? And he said, all he knew from his time in service was when women got pregnant, they were discharged. I'm like, no, I'd never heard such a thing. It turns out by then, fortunately, it was an option, but it was not mandatory. So there was that. And while we look to today that we're on average getting close to 20% of the military is comprised now of women, that it was capped until the late 60s, 20 years basically, capped at 2%. I think we've made great strides. And again, Marilla reminds me and has helped to be that senior advisor to me that as I'm learning and cutting my teeth on all of this information, it's the needs of the government, it's needs of the country that gives women in particular opportunities in the military. And when they needed us more and more, they had to open the aperture wider and wider so that more of us now have the opportunities to where now every career field is wide open. But it certainly wasn't that way in 1948 when this was first founded.
Thank you, Phyllis. And I think your personal story just really emphasizes the impact that this act had and how it took long-term processes to really transition away from the act. So I was wondering if you could both share a little bit more about those shortcomings that remained for military women after the act. I think many of our young soldiers, sailors, and female airmen today might be surprised at the restrictions that act left in place.
Well, I'll start this for sure, Phyllis, because this discussion could last forever. Certainly, the few people know that there was a grade restriction as well. The highest grade that a woman could hold was lieutenant colonel or commander. And if she was the chief or the commandant of that women's component, she was temporarily promoted to the next higher grade. And if she decided to stay, when that tour was over, she reverted back to that lower grade, lieutenant colonel or commander, and would serve in that grade until she retired, at which time she would get the retirement of that higher grade. But it's crazy to me. And you want to know why? I think one of the most amusing stories of why there was a cap on that grade is that because the male members of Congress thought that maybe women would be going through menopause at about that age. And our president emeritus used to say that her phrase was that, and those men thought that women would make irrational decisions. And her follow-on phrase was, and we all know men always make rational decisions. But nevertheless, I mean, while we kind of poke fun at that, indeed, menopause was a major issue in that they may become incapacitated during that time frame. And it took then, the Navy Surgeon General to say, no, that's not the case, that they can certainly operate quite well during that time frame. Another major thing that few of us know about was until 1973, if a military woman was married to a civilian, that civilian was not authorized dependent status. Therefore, he could not get an ID card. He couldn't use the commissary or the PX. Or the hospital. She was treated as a single military member. She didn't get quarters. Now the caveat of that was, unless one could prove that spouse was dependent upon more than 50% of his livelihood. And the same thing with children was that they couldn't have you could have a dependent child, but again, it had to be 50% of the child's dependency. But there was kind of a catch-22 in that, because the services didn't recruit or assess women with children. And if they had children, they would became pregnant, they would have to leave the military. So it was quite a deterrent. And that was until 1973, when a young Air Force officer, Sharon Frontiero, sued, and that case eventually was picked up by the American Civil Liberties Union and carried all the way to the Supreme Court by a young lawyer named Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And we were, that part of the legislation fell away.
Wow, thank you for that. And, just again, talking about some connections to Arlington National Cemetery, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. So we can use her story to talk about women's fight for equality in the military. Phyllis, do you have anything you want to add to that question about those shortcomings?
I want to really talk for a quick second about in 1948 until when I joined the service in 1981. And I felt like, okay, well, maybe that's why I didn't know about it. It was long before I was ever born and so forth. But it's interesting how our young ladies of today are completely uninformed of this through no fault of their own. Why would you know? But a closer connection is that Marilla Cushman joined the service shortly after Ruth Bader Ginsburg took this case all the way to the Supreme Court. She had married a civilian man and had stepkids. And when she reported to her first duty assignment with them, she was utterly unaware that only a few short months sooner, had she arrived, she would have been treated as a single soldier. But because that case had been won just months prior, she walked in the door, she was given on-post housing and all of the benefits, and her husband got a dependent ID card like any wife would have. And she was utterly blissfully unaware that that was actually the reason at that moment anyway. So I encourage all of those that are listening now, and maybe if they watch it later, you would be fascinated at the amount of history that goes into just telling the story and the how and the why of women in the military. So I think, Allison, you're a perfect one to be helping to shepherd us through this as a historian.
No, thank you. And I'm really glad that we could hear Marilla's story as well. While we're really focused right now on the topic of the 1948 Act, I want to ask you about a woman who was really critical to the passage of that act. Her name was Margaret Chase Smith. What can you all share about Margaret Chase Smith for our audience? Why do they need to know who she is?
Oh, Marilla's got to answer this. She's the only one that can do it right.
As a Mainer, Margaret Chase Smith, at the time she was a representative, Margaret Chase Smith was truly the champion of this legislation. She certainly did, work with Edith North Rogers, had her testify on a number of occasions about why this legislation was important. But I mean, she was a bulldog. She did not stop. She met with the Secretary of Defense at the time, Forrestal. She talked with every single one of the senior general and admiral officers like Eisenhower, Bradley, Spaatz, all of those folks that could stand up and support this legislation, because indeed they did. Every one of them supported this legislation. Oddly, it was the members of Congress who did not. So Margaret Chase Smith was pivotal in this legislation. And as I said, she was a bulldog, didn't stop until it was passed. So, we certainly lift her and speak her story as often as we can. a real champion of military women.
And on the rooftop of the Military Women's Memorial, on our glass tablets that we have as part of our ceiling, there is a quote by Margaret Chase Smith exactly about this and the landmark. I cannot imagine what the work must have felt like at the time when, the expectation was that women stayed home, kept the house, raised the kids. And this, as Marilla so lovingly calls her, a bulldog to go through this. And on June 12th of this year, we will again present a Margaret Chase Smith Leadership Award to a proper Grand Dame, which in fact is Brigadier General Wilma Vaught, the founder and president emeritus of the Military Women's Memorial. So this is, the 75th anniversary, and it seems right and fitting that it will be General Vaught that will receive the Margaret Chase Smith Award in just a few days.
Oh, that's wonderful. And for those of you in the audience who are able to come to Arlington, visit the cemetery, please visit the Women's Memorial. It's so powerful and evocative to look up at that glass ceiling in the memorial and see those quotes, whether you're looking down at them from the roof or from underneath. So I'd like to ask you both a question about 1948. 1948 was really a pivotal year of massive change for the military because in addition to the Women's Armed Services Integration Act, 1948 was also the year that President Truman issued his executive order to end racial segregation in the military. Did these two acts intersect with each other at all? How can we really conceptualize the ending of racial segregation in the military happening in the same year that women were starting to be more fully integrated into the armed forces as well?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in real quickly and then hand it over to Marilla. During World War II, the women that were serving did not put up with the segregation to the extent, of course, we were a much smaller cohort as our male counterparts did. And at times, there's photos even down at the Army Women's Museum down at Fort Gregg Adams, where you see women marching in a parade, and it is a mixed bag of all ethnicities within that one formation. That did not happen in that same era on the male side. And I think part of that and understanding, it was time. And certainly women had proven themselves through World War I and World War II, and likewise, certainly with the minorities, whether you talk African American or Hispanics, but in particular the African Americans, they had gone and served admirably in World War I and again in II. And I think there were enough people that had seen it, and so many that were in Congress were in fact veterans, and they knew what they had seen, and it was finally a watershed moment. That year of 48 set the conditions for so many Americans to serve in far greater capacity than ever before.
Oh, thank you. Marilla, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I can only second what Phyllis has said, and it's the Army, actually the WACs were the only ones who were integrated. The Navy and Marine Corps chose not to do so, and toward the very end, the Coast Guard did, but the impetus was actually Eleanor Roosevelt and her relationship with Mary McLeod Bethune. And, they insisted that when the Women's Army Corps was created, or the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was created, that indeed African-American women would serve. Another great place where African-American women were serving was in the Cadet Nurse Corps. We haven't talked about that. A great opportunity for all women, certainly, to get a professional, to be professionally trained as nurses. More than 100,000 of them were part of this program. And that because of the nursing shortage, again, we get back to, it's always about need, isn't it? When that aperture opens. But we needed nurses. And that was getting, even more critical as we went into this war and we're sending nurses overseas. So we created this Cadet Nurse Corps. And indeed, I'm getting a bit off topic here, but indeed, it was insisted that African-American women of color would be part of that program. So so I guess I'd like to think that we were sort of the women's groups were part of that experiment, so to speak, that said, yes, this can work. And yes, we need these great minds and patriots to be part of our military.
Thank you. I really appreciate both of your remarks because I think it's important to recognize that we're really looking at both of those anniversaries right now.
Mhm.
And just to keep us on with the theme of anniversaries, 2023 is also the 50th anniversary of the all volunteer force. And thinking about how the all volunteer force happened, obviously, after the 1948 Integration Act, how do you think women's recruiting efforts and the need for women who volunteered for the military changed or shifted once the military became an all volunteer force? Because, of course, women were not being drafted, which is another topic we can talk about. So, what did that mean for women in recruiting them?
I'll be quick, and Marilla, you close it up for me here. But certainly, as they were looking at, we're going to do away with the draft and move to an all volunteer force for those young people here. The Vietnam War was going on, and it was not well received here at home. So the idea that there would be enough young men that would willingly sign up for the military in the early 1970s, they all knew in the Pentagon that was just not going to happen. But of course, we had been capped at 2% of the military. And they said, boy, we're going to have to take that ceiling, that 2% limit off from our women. But what would cause them to want to join in larger numbers when they're capped, as Marilla had said previously? They could only make so much rank. And if you got pregnant, you were out, and all these other stipulations. And so they said, boy, we're going to have to take that off. We're going to have to make some changes. And so by 1970, we actually had 2 women on the same day promoted to 1-star general. First time in history in 1970. But again, as things continue to go, so that the all-volunteer force of 1973 goes into full force, there already were looking at, because previous to that, women weren't going to ROTC programs. They weren't going, certainly the service academies were not open until a couple of years after that. So they had to make a lot of changes to say, we've got to find a way to court a whole 50% of America to join, to help fulfill an all-volunteer force. So 50 years experiment, we'll see how it goes. What do you think, Marilla?
Yeah, I can only echo what you said, Phyllis. The onset of the all-volunteer force was huge with respect to military women. The Vietnam War, it was a long, drawn-out war, and people were tired of the war, the draft, and certainly this whole cohort, 50% of the U.S. population that was restricted from serving, were they were pretty sweet looking group of folks to be able to come in. And another thing that was going on, kind of this connection of events here in America, was the women's movement, where all of these things kind of came together to encourage the service of women, and certainly for the military to look at women as a viable resource. And again, it's about need. The recruiting was abysmal. That's when I came into the Army. I came in 1972, and it was certainly a sea change with respect to what women were doing. My class was the first class of officers, WAC officers, to have weapons training. I mean, everything was changing. It was amazing.
Thank you both. That answer really illuminates a lot of these intersections between women's service in the military and the larger shifts happening within defense in the United States. So it's 1:45 where I am on the East Coast. So what I'm going to start doing is I'm going to continue to ask our panelists questions, but I want to also open up our Q&A to the audience. So please throw some questions into that Q&A box. And before I do my next question, I'm going to give you both some questions from the audience. So one is a comment that I want to touch upon, and this is from Diane. So Diane is taking us back to our discussion about racial segregation in the military, and she makes a really good point that in World War II, those women who served in the military were in fact racially segregated. So a great example that she mentioned is the 6888, which was a postal battalion of all Black women who played a critical role sorting and working with the mail overseas in Europe. Those women were segregated. So even though there were Black women serving, they were in segregated units. And if this is a topic you want to learn more about, I know the Women's Memorial has done a lot of work on it. And at Arlington National Cemetery, in our African American History Education module, we have a lot of materials about the 6888 and about the other Black women who served in segregated capacities during World War II. So you can find that at education.arlingtoncemetery.mil. And if that's something that you're interested in, you could do an entire afternoon or even a day starting at the exhibits in the Military Women's Memorial and then entering the cemetery and following our walking tour to learn about the amazing men and women of color who did serve during different conflicts in our history. So I have a question from Karen, and Karen, you read my mind.
Can I jump in on that real quickly too? Yes, we have an amazing exhibit inside the Military Women's Memorial called The Color of Freedom that honors the diversity of America's service women. And we have Charity Adams Early's uniform and her story, the commanding officer of the 6888. We've worked very hard for the last, well, not this past year, but the 2 years prior to that, lobbying up on the Hill to be one of the strong advocates with others like Colonel Edna Cummings to get the Congressional Gold Medal for the 6888, an amazing story. Tyler Perry is making a Netflix film about it. Blair Underwood is executive producing a musical on Broadway that will come out in about a year or so about the 6888. That is a staggering story. And yes, you are right. They did segregate them, but while they were in training together, if they were out at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, the Black and the white women, the women of all ethnicities, they ate and dined together. They did a lot of things together because they just weren't going to stand for it. And certainly when the 6888 got over to England and senior people within our military wanted to give them an R&R house in London, but it needed to be separate from the white women. Charity, the commanding officer, she wouldn't have it. We get a house, we're all women, we're all coming in together. And she said, you can get it, but we won't ever use it. And so, I mean, again, I think that's some of that sticking point. And you're right too about the Black nurses. They were not typically authorized to care for white Americans. Oh, they could care for white German POWs, but they couldn't for our white Americans. But one of those things that we are now looking at too is we're championing up on Capitol Hill the Congressional Gold Medal for the World War II nurses, 72,000 nurses that served in World War II, all of them living or deceased, Congressional Gold, as we are with the Hello Girls of World War I.
No, thank you, Phyllis. And that actually answers a question that I was going to throw at you and that we also got from an attendee. What can you do to help support these recognition efforts for women who were really left behind during the time that they were living? So we have the Cadet Nurse Corps, we have the Hello Girls, we have a lot of projects about the 6888. So if you're interested in that, please, you can definitely contact the Women's Memorial, but there's a lot of materials out there as well. I believe the Doughboy Foundation has a lot of materials for that.
They do. And I would challenge everyone that feels that some cohort, some group, some unit has been short shrifted, and they, trust me, they have. There's 21 people that work at the Military Women's Memorial / Foundation. I would love to write more articles about these staggering stories. We cannot do it alone. Allison can't write enough books. There's just not enough hours in a day. But I will challenge any of you that are watching this. We can get you the information. You can fall in love with a group, a woman, an entity, and challenge you to write an article. Get it published in your local newspaper. Get it published broader. I don't care, but help to tell these stories rather than at times I feel like we have people that come into the building, they look at all of this and say, God, I never knew. And that's so true. I didn't know after 37 years in the Army. I didn't know. So I don't hold it against anybody. I just ask you, help us to get these stories out so the rest of America knows about it.
So if there's any history students on right now, or English, or anybody else, and you're looking for a thesis or dissertation topic, this is your call to action. Britta and the team at the Military Women's Memorial are really, really wonderful at helping students do research. So a couple of you are reading my mind and asking questions that were on my list to ask, which is fantastic. So I think Karen, Jackie, and Elizabeth asked a really important question. What are the remaining hurdles that face America's military women? What are the barriers that still have to be overcome? In 2013, the ban on women in combat positions was lifted, which changed a lot for women and opened up many more opportunities. But what is there still left to achieve, and what are the biggest challenges facing our military women today?
Well, we have a Women, Peace, and Security educational series that we run, and that's really looking to the future about what can women do that help on the peace and security side across the globe. And you're right, Allison. Yes, in 2016 they actually finally implemented the restriction on ground combat, but around the same time, about a decade ago, women were finally authorized to serve on submarines, and only in the 90s were all platforms of ships and airframes authorized for women to be aboard. I will tell you that we still are working. Another one that we're doing is a health and wellness series, because anybody that's worn a uniform, a military woman, you know that your kit, the rucksacks, the body armor, all of the things, they don't fit the way they should. And I will tell you that, we've talked with some of the military women that are now serving up on Capitol Hill. They're aware of it. We're just trying to figure out, how do you fix that? Because let's look at all of us just on this panel. None of us are created the same. And so how do you come up with, it's not a one size fits all on all of our gear. So how do we figure that? And also, as a registered nurse, let's look at clinically different times of a month, shortly after you've had a child. You can gain and lose 5-10 pounds and more without half trying, especially if you've just had a child, if you're breastfeeding, if you're one of those that tends to hold a lot of body fluid while you're having your period. All of those are things that we've got to look at if you're going to have a career in the military. How do we come up with uniforms and attire and kit that work for you? And I don't think we've cracked that code properly yet.
Marilla, do you want to add anything?
Well, I would certainly reinforce what Phyllis had said. I think if you went to some of these women who stepped into particularly the combat arms arena, they would tell you the biggest challenge is their gear. And they're coming home with injuries and disabilities. So, it is a readiness issue. It's not, we're not just fussing. It is a readiness issue for the military. And I think, another challenge for all military members is this work-life balance. We've been in this long, protracted global war on terror. We've had, multiple deployments of military members, military couples, issues with children. So, and it's just something, it is what it is. But nevertheless, it is a challenge for military service. In the end, I think, we owe such a debt to these young people who are serving today, who've stepped up and continue to step up to protect our freedoms in any conflict. So, there are issues out there. There are a lot of smart people looking at those issues, though, too. So I have great faith in our future, and certainly in the future of military women. And Phyllis mentioned, it was 1970 when the first women were promoted to general officer, and today we have 4 stars, in commanding. We have the commandant of the Coast Guard. We have women who are now eligible to be, who are combatant commanders and therefore eligible to be members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's just, I look back on, when I joined the Army in 1972 and where we are today. I mean, they're just things that I never, ever could have dreamed. I remember when we were arguing about, women coming home in body bags. Oh, they just can't, or that we need to, that we're a distraction in a unit to the fellow soldiers. That's why they can't be in combat, or, we would disrupt unit cohesion. And all of those arguments have been dispelled and fallen away, so that we are members of the team. And I'd say doing pretty darn well. I'm certainly proud and a little bit jealous. I often think, I look back and think, gosh, could I have been that good? If the tables had turned, could I be that good? But they're just remarkable.
Well, I'm confident you could have, Marilla. And now you and Phyllis are such great examples for our military women. We are running out of time and we're getting so many great questions. So I'm going to try and get at least one more in. Thank you all for your questions. A really fantastic question from Elizabeth. Why do you think it's important for today's female service members and veterans to understand this history?
I'll be quick on that, because I would have been a better soldier. I was a pretty good soldier. I would have been even better had I known the history. What these women endured and went through to blaze trails for me, I owe them. And all of the women today owe it to people like Marilla, and even to me and the foremothers before us. What they did changed it and made it so much, not easier, but very different than it was back in the day. And that's what we do at the Military Women's Memorial. We encourage every woman to put their story in our national database. If they don't put their story there, I really say it isn't about what you did or didn't do. It's about proving that what they did 2 generations back laid the scene so that you can serve in any career field you now choose to do. And that's really why I think it's important that America, and especially our young women, know the journey that military women have done for over 100 years to get us to where we are today.
I'm going to have to jump in now. And on behalf of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library in Chicago, the Arlington National Cemetery, and the Military Women's Memorial in Washington, D.C., thank you for taking your time to learn about the evolution of women's service in our military. And thank you to each of our speakers. We invite you to explore more in the collections at the Pritzker Military Museum and Library and the Women's Military Memorial. The PMML holds a collection of objects, archives, books, and oral histories, 15 of which are available on our website. And the Military Women's Memorial holds over 8,000 donations of documents, photographs, oral histories, uniforms, objects, and audiovisuals, including an impressive 1,200 oral histories from World War I to the present. You can learn more about all of our upcoming program opportunities on our websites. We hope that you enjoyed today's program, and thank you for joining us. This concludes our program.